and today let's talk about the Industrial Revolution. And the Industrial Revolution I'm talking about today will be mostly the Industrial Revolution that occurs in England in the 18th century. Several things to start with. First of all, Industrial Revolution, it's not really an accurate term. That's because it's not really a revolution. What does happen is certainly change, but change occurs not overnight, not in a fortnight, not in a couple of weeks, not in a month, not even in a year. Really, the English Industrial Revolution gained steam, so to speak, over the course maybe of a century in the 18th century. By no means is it completed in that century. It goes on and on and on. Some people would say that the Industrial Revolution continues now even in its information revolution stage. Anyway, revolution, not a very good term because we're really talking about something which is long term. All right, why England? Why England? Certainly the Industrial Revolution spreads out from England. Eventually, much of Europe will be industrialized. Well, England, first of all, has many natural advantages. First of all, it's very small. You can't really be very far from the sea no matter where you are. And speaking of the sea, England will build and will have very good port facilities where it can export and where it can import goods. So England's the size is very important. Secondly, it's insular. That is to say, we're talking about an island. Very difficult for England to be conquered. England also has the advantage of not being on the continent and sharing a border with other powers. So it has natural advantages. It has abundant water supplies. It has abundant coal and iron supplies. So the natural resources that it needs are there abundantly. It also will have a unified government after the revolution of 1688-89, and that's going to play certainly into everything as well. Plus the fact that England has always really promoted a very strong navy, and that's going to give it a presence around much of the world, if not the entire world. So that's some of the reasons why England will have the Industrial Revolution first. Now, what does that mean? What are the actual? What does that actually mean to say there's an Industrial Revolution? Really, we're talking about a number of revolutions which kind of coincide. Let me go over some of those. The demographic revolution. You know, you really can't have an industrial revolution of any kind whatsoever unless you have an expanding population. Expanding population means one thing or two things: cheaper labor and also more consumers. And England is going to have exactly that in the 18th century. The population, in fact, of England is going to go 1700 from 5.5 million to 1800, 11 million. 1850, 22 million. So the population growing very rapidly, doubling and doubling again in the space of 150 years. Demographic revolution comes about for a number of reasons. First of all, England is not involved in as many continental wars because it's not part of the continent. Its wars are going to be mostly naval, even though England is a colonial power in the 18th century, but much of the fighting, many of the wars will be conducted on the sea. So that means fewer casualties due to wartime. There's other factors as well. Prices are falling in the 18th century, generally speaking. That's because of the agricultural revolution. And that's going to mean that the more plentiful food, cheaper food, people will be able to get married younger ages, they'll have more children. And then also there's significant advances in terms of land development, as lands are cleared, as basically more land is put into farming. For example, malaria, the incidence of that diseases will also lower, so you'll have the people living longer, life expectancy will grow. So a number of factors, more births, longer life expectancy and so on, the demographic revolution. You also have an agricultural revolution in the 18th century, and there's a number of reasons for that. First of all, more land has been put into productive use in England because of something called enclosure, something going on from roughly 1689 and continuing from that point. And that means that more and more of the commons are put into productive use for the growing of food, as you have more and more of a market for that. So excuse me, so the agricultural revolution is going to be extremely important for feeding England. That means also there's a number of other technological advances. For example, horses will replace oxen. Horses are going to be much more efficient. Instead of 4 to 8 oxen, you can now use 2 horses. Instead of 2 men, you can have 1. So that alone is going to increase the food supply. And then you have other technical advances. The Rotterdam triangular plow, for example, comes along early in the 18th century, makes plowing much better. The seed drill makes it much more efficient to plant seeds, and more will sprout into growth. So when you add the technical advantages, also I should say, crop rotation, more and more of that, constant tillage, more and more of that. Combine all of these things, and you really have an agricultural revolution. And then you've got a commercial revolution, also very important, because you're going to have a system of trilateral trade. Eventually it's going to add Asia, which will be more like a quadrilateral trade, from triangular to quadrangular trade. And I'm talking about, of course, the opening up of America, Africa, the European continent, and then ultimately Asia, China. How does that trade system work? Well, I'm sorry that much of it, of course, is based on slavery, and here's how it works. From Europe, you'll have, for example, manufactured goods of sorts, textile goods, for example, and these will be sent from Europe to Africa. And what comes from Africa, of course, is going to be things like ivory and gold and slaves. Slaves will be taken to America, and they will be the foundation of the plantation system there. And from America, of course, will come tobacco, cotton, sugar, indigo, and some other lesser crops as well. But especially we're talking about tobacco, sugar. These are the really important plantation crops, and of course, let's not forget cotton as well. As far as China, gold, ivory going there, coming back will be teas, and of course porcelains, and the kind of silk textiles, and then of course coffees also from the Far East. So when you take all of those items, many of those things coming back to Europe, England is the center of all that, and England is going to prosper mightily from that. You could say really in the 18th century, much of what England prospers from is going to be the plantation system and slavery and sugar. That's going to be the fount of the prosperity of England. What comes out of all this, of course, is also capital, profit, money, and that's going to fuel what will become a kind of a financial revolution, really a banking system. This is where your capital comes from. Some of it comes, of course, also from the agricultural revolution, but all of that's going to funnel in. That's where your capital is. That's where your credit is. That's going to sort of be the fuel of the industrial revolution. So when you add all these revolutions so far that I've mentioned, you're already well on your way. Now also the transport revolution, because England is flat, and England has a system of canals that's built basically privately in the 18th century. So the canals are going to allow England to kind of transport things around England to the ports, and from there abroad. And of course the steam engine is developed in the 18th century. The 1780s becomes much more efficient than the earlier ones. And the steam engine is essentially the steamships, which will be developed more in the, especially in the 19th century. And I don't need to tell you that the steam engine combined with wheels, and you have the train. And that's going to really come into vogue already in the 1820s and 1830s. And by mid-19th century, you'll have the beginnings, at least, if not the conclusions, of the rail systems that will be built not only in England, but around Europe, to some extent, fostered by the English. So the transport revolution. Finally, a technological revolution, which actually kind of revolutionizes production altogether. And I'm talking about cotton in particular. Cotton becomes truly king even in the 18th century. As we know, cotton will be grown in the American South. There's other areas as well where cotton will be grown, particularly in Egypt and then India. Cotton is going to emerge as the crop, as the commodity for a number of reasons. First of all, it can be grown in many different areas, those I just mentioned, America and parts of Africa as well, and in Egypt. It can be grown plentifully. You can expand its production very easily. There are many different soil conditions which help cotton. Cotton also was the kind of thing, it was not as capital intensive as some other industries. It was more labor intensive, and of course the demographic revolution is occurring, so you have your labor, and I don't need to tell you that slaves were also employed in some areas for this. And then you have a cluster of innovations. By 1787, you already have the power loom, which is essentially hooking up the steam engine to kind of a mechanical production for weaving and for spinning and weaving. So technical innovations here, which really have kind of evolved over the 18th century, make it possible for the mass production of cotton textile goods. And England becomes really the center, the world center, actually displacing India, which had become in 1763 more or less a colony of the British. In any case, the technological revolution is boosted by cotton, and that kind of helps bring together just about everything else, all the way from the demographic revolution to the commercial revolution, and so on. So not being capital intensive, being labor intensive, definite advantage. Of course, the other thing is there's more consumers for cotton goods. Cotton is the kind of textile good that can be worn in just about anywhere. It's much easier to produce, and it's much more comfortable in many climates than something like wool. Other things important too, the development of iron, and eventually in the 19th century steel. Of course, that's going to be get a tremendous impetus from the development of the railroad. Taking all these things together, over the long run, certainly not quickly, but over the long run, you really do have industrialization. You really do have something like a revolution, if not an absolute revolution. And together, the Industrial Revolution, which spreads out from England throughout the 19th century and has really transformed the world which we inherited ourselves today. And that's it for the Industrial Revolution. Thank you, and we'll see you next time.